Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. The Secret Doctrine. Ancient Thought and Modern Dress. Modern science is ancient thought distorted, and no more. We have seen, however, what intuitional scientists think and are busy about, and now the reader shall be given a few more proofs of the fact that more than one is unconsciously approaching the derided secret sciences. With regard to cosmogony and primeval matter, modern speculations are undeniably ancient thought, improved by contradictory theories of recent origin. The whole foundation belongs to Grecian and Indian archaic astronomy and physics, in those days called always philosophy. In all the Aryan and Greek speculations, we meet with the conception of an all-pervading, unorganized, and homogeneous matter, or chaos, renamed by modern scientists nebular condition of the world stuff. What Anaxagoras called chaos in his Homoimeria is now called primitive fluid by Sir William Thomson. The Hindu and Greek atomists Kanada, Leucippus, Democritus, Epicurus, Lucretius are now reflected, as in a clear mirror, in the supporters of the atomic theory of our modern days, beginning with Leibniz's monads and ending with the vortical atoms of Sir William Thomson. True, the corpuscular theory of old is rejected, and the undulatory theory has taken its place. But the question is whether the latter is so firmly established as not to be liable to be dethroned like its predecessor. Light, from its metaphysical aspect, has been fully treated in Isis Unveiled. Light is the first begotten and the first emanation of the Supreme, and light is life, says the evangelist and the Kabbalist. Both are electricity, the life principle, the anima mundi pervading the universe, the electric vivifier of all things. Light is the great protean magician, and under the divine will of the architect, or rather the architects, the builders called one collectively, its multifarious omnipotent waves gave birth to every form, as well as to every living being. From its swelling electric bosom spring matter and spirit. Within its beams lie the beginnings of all physical and chemical action, and of all cosmic and spiritual phenomena. It vitalizes and disorganizes, it gives life and produces death, and from its primordial point, gradually emerged into existence the myriads of worlds, visible and invisible celestial bodies. It was at the ray of this first mother, 1 and 3, that God, according to Plato, lighted a fire which we now call the sun, and which is not the cause of either light or heat, but merely the focus, or, as we might say, the lens, by which the rays of the primordial light become materialized, are concentrated upon our solar system, and produce all the correlations of forces. This is the ether, as just explained in the views of Metcalfe, repeated by Dr. Richardson, save for the submission of the former to some details of the modern undulatory theory. We do not say that we deny the theory, we assert only that it needs completion and rearrangement. But the occultists are by no means the only heretics in this respect, for Mr. Robert Hunt finds that the undulatory theory does not account for the results of his experiments. Sir David Brewster, in his treatise on optics, showing that the colors of vegetable life arise from a specific attraction which the particles of these bodies exercise over the differently colored rays of light, and that it is by the light of the sun that the colored juices of plants are elaborated, that the colors of bodies are changed, etc. Remarks that it is not easy to allow that such effects can be produced by the mere vibration of an ethereal medium. And he is forced, he says, by this class of facts, to reason as if light was material. Professor Josiah P. Cook of Harvard University says that he cannot agree with those who regard the wave theory of light as an established principle of science. Herschel's doctrine that the intensity of light, in effect of each undulation, is inversely as the square of the distance from the luminous body if correct, damages a good deal, if it does not kill, the undulatory theory. That he is right was proved repeatedly by experiments with photometers, and though it begins to be much doubted, the undulatory theory is still alive. To this remark of Sir David Brewster forced to reason as if light was material, there is a good deal to reply. Light, in one sense, is certainly as material as is electricity itself. And if electricity is not material, if it is only a mode of motion, how is it that it can be stored up in Fors accumulators? Helmholtz says that electricity must be as atomic as matter, and Mr. W. Crookes supported the view in his address at Birmingham in 1886 to the chemical section of the British Association, of which he was president. This is what Helmholtz says. If we accept the hypothesis that the elementary substances are composed of atoms, we cannot avoid concluding that electricity also, positive as well as negative, is divided into definite elementary portions, which behave like atoms of electricity. Here we have to repeat that which was already said in section 8, that there is but one science that can henceforth direct modern research into the one path which will lead to the discovery of the whole, hitherto occult truth, and it is the youngest of all chemistry, as it now stands reformed. There is no other, not excluding astronomy, that can so unerringly guide scientific intuition as can chemistry. Two proofs of this are to be found in the world of science. Two great chemists, each among the greatest in his own country, namely, Mr. Crookes and the late Professor Butlerov. The one is a thorough believer in abnormal phenomena, the other was as fervid a spiritualist as he was great in the natural sciences. It becomes evident that, while pondering over the ultimate divisibility of matter, and in the hitherto fruitless chase after the element of negative atomic weight, the scientifically trained mind of the chemist must feel irresistibly drawn towards those ever-shrouded worlds, to that mysterious beyond, whose measureless depths seem to close against the approach of the too materialistic hand that would fain draw aside its veil. It is the unknown, and the ever unknowable, warns the monist agnostic. Not so, answers the persevering chemist. We are on the track and we are not daunted, and fain would we enter the mysterious region which ignorance tickets unknown. In his presidential address at Birmingham, Mr. Crookes said, "There is but one unknown, the ultimate substratum of spirit space. That which is not the absolute, and the one is, in virtue of that very differentiation, however far removed from the physical senses, always accessible to the spiritual human mind, which is a coruscation of the undifferentiable integral." 2 or 3 sentences, at the very close of his lecture on the genesis of the elements, showed the eminent scientist to be on the royal road to the greatest discoveries. He has been for some time overshadowing the original protyle, and he has come to the conclusion that he who grasps the key will be permitted to unlock some of the deepest mysteries of creation. Protyle, as the great chemist explains, is a word analogous to protoplasm, to express the idea of the original primal matter existing before the evolution of the chemical elements. The word I have ventured to use for this purpose is compounded of, earlier than, and, the stuff of which things are made. The word is scarcely a new coinage, for 600 years ago Roger Bacon wrote in his Art Chimie, "The elements are made out of dot, and every element is converted into the nature of another element." The knowledge of Roger Bacon did not come to this wonderful old magician by inspiration, but because he studied ancient works on magic and alchemy and had a key to the real meaning of their language. But see what Mr. Crookes says of Prothyle, next neighbor to the unconscious Mulapercreti of the occultists. Let us start at the moment when the first element came into existence. Before this time, matter, as we know it, was not. It is equally impossible to conceive of matter without energy, as of energy without matter. From one point of view, both are convertible terms. Before the birth of atoms, all those forms of energy, which become evident when matter acts upon matter, could not have existed. They were locked up in the Prothyle as latent potentialities only. Coincident with the creation of atoms, all those attributes and properties, which form the means of discriminating one chemical element from another, start into existence fully endowed with energy. With every respect due to the great knowledge of the lecturer, the occultist would put it otherwise. He would say that no atom is ever created, for the atoms are eternal within the bosom of the one atom. The atom of atoms viewed during Manvantara as the jagged yoni, the material causative womb of the world. Pradhana, unmodified matter, that which is the first form of Prakriti, material, visible, as well as invisible nature, and Purusha, spirit, are eternally one. And they are nirapati, without adventitious qualities or attributes, only during pralaya, and when beyond any of the planes of consciousness of existence. The atom, as known to modern science, is inseparable from Purusha, which is spirit, but is now called energy in science. The Prothyle atom has not been comminuted or subtilized. It has simply passed into that plane, which is no plane, but the eternal state of everything beyond the planes of illusion. Both Purusha and Pradhana are immutable and unconsumable, or aparinaman and avyaya, in eternity, and both may be referred to during the Mayavik periods as Vyaya and Parinaman, or that which can expand, pass away and disappear, and which is modifiable. In this sense, Purusha must, of course, be held distinct in our conceptions from Parabrahman. Nevertheless, that which is called energy or force in science, and which has been explained as a dual force by Metcalfe, is never, in fact, and cannot be, energy alone, for it is the substance of the world, its soul, the all-permanent, Sarvaga, in conjunction with Kala, time. The three are the Trinity in one. During Manvantara, the all-potential unity, which acts as three distinct things on Maya, the plane of illusion. In the Orphic philosophy of ancient Greece, they were called Phanes, chaos, and Chronos, the triad of the occult philosophers of that period. But see how closely Mr. Crookes brushes the unknowable, and what potentialities there are for the acceptance of occult truths in his discoveries. He continues, speaking of the evolution of atoms. Let us pause at the end of the first complete vibration and examine the result. We have already found the elements of water, ammonia, carbonic acid, the atmosphere, plant and animal life, phosphorus for the brain, salt for the seas, clay for the solid earth, phosphates and silicates sufficient for a world, and inhabitants not so very different from what we enjoy at the present day. True, the human inhabitants would have to live in a state of more than Arcadian simplicity, and the absence of calcic phosphate would be awkward as far as the bone is concerned. At the lower end of our curve we see a great hiatus. This oasis, and the blanks which precede and follow it, may be referred with much probability to the particular way in which our Earth developed into a member of our solar system. If this be so, it may be that on our Earth only these blanks occur, and not generally throughout the universe. This justifies several assertions in the occult works. Firstly, that neither the stars nor the sun can be said to be constituted of those terrestrial elements with which the chemist is familiar, though they are all present in the sun's outward robes as well as a host more of elements so far unknown to science. Secondly, that our globe has its own special laboratory on the faraway outskirts of its atmosphere, crossing which every atom and molecule changes and differentiates from its primordial nature. And thirdly, that though no element present on our Earth could ever possibly be found wanting in the sun, there are many others there which have either not reached or not as yet been discovered on our globe. Some may be missing in certain stars and heavenly bodies in the process of formation, or, though present in them, these elements, on account of their present state, may not respond as yet to the usual scientific tests. Mr. Crookes speaks of helium, an element of still lower atomic weight than hydrogen, an element purely hypothetical as far as our Earth is concerned, though existing in abundance in the chromosphere of the sun. Occult science adds that not one of the elements regarded as such by chemistry really deserves the name. Again, we find Mr. Crookes speaking with approbation of Dr. Carnley's weighty argument in favor of the compound nature of the so-called elements, from their analogy to the compound radicals. Hitherto, alchemy alone, within the historical period, and in the so-called civilized countries, has succeeded in obtaining a real element, or a particle of homogeneous matter, the mysterium magnum of Paracelsus. But then that was before Lord Bacon's day. Let us now turn to the upper portion of the scheme. With hydrogen of atomic weight equals 1, there is little room for other elements, save, perhaps, for hypothetical helium. But what if we get through the looking glass and cross the zero line in search of new principles? What shall we find on the other side of zero? Dr. Carnley asks for an element of negative atomic weight. Here is ample room and verge enough for a shadow series of such unsubstantialities. Helmholtz says that electricity is probably as atomic as matter. Is electricity one of the negative elements, and the luminiferous ether another? Matter, as we now know it, does not here exist. The forms of energy which are apparent in the motions of matter are as yet only latent possibilities. A substance of negative weight is not inconceivable. But can we form a clear conception of a body which combines with other bodies in proportions expressible by negative qualities? A genesis of the elements such as is here sketched out would not be confined to our little solar system, but would probably follow the same general sequence of events in every center of energy, now visible as a star. Before the birth of atoms to gravitate towards one another, no pressure could be exercised, but at the outskirts of the fire mist sphere, within which all is proteilat, the shell on which the tremendous forces involved in the birth of a chemical element exert full sway, the fierce heat would be accompanied by gravitation, sufficient to keep the newly born elements from flying off into space. As temperature increases, expansion and molecular motion increase, molecules tend to fly asunder, and their chemical affinities become deadened, but the enormous pressure of the gravitation of the mass of atomic matter, outside what I may for brevity call the birth shell, would counteract the action of heat. Beyond the birth shell would be a space in which no chemical action could take place, owing to the temperature there being above what is called the dissociation point for compounds. In this space the lion and the lamb would lie down together. Phosphorus and oxygen would mix without union. Hydrogen and chlorine would show no tendency to closer bonds. And even fluorine, that energetic gas which chemists have only isolated within the last month or two, would float about free and uncombined. Outside this space of free atomic matter would be another shell, in which the formed chemical elements would have cooled down to the combination point, and the sequence of events so graphically described by Mr. Matthew Williams in The Fuel of the Sun would now take place, culminating in the solid Earth and the commencement of geological time. This is, in strictly scientific, but beautiful language, the description of the evolution of the differentiated universe in the Secret Teachings. The learned gentleman closes his address in words, every sentence of which is like a flash of light from beyond the dark veil of materiality, hitherto thrown upon the exact sciences, and is a step forward towards the sanctum sanctorum of the occult. Thus he says, "We have glanced at the difficulty of defining an element. We have noticed, too, the revolt of many leading physicists and chemists against the ordinary acceptation of the term element. We have weighed the improbability of their eternal existence, or their origination by chance. As a remaining alternative, we have suggested their origin by a process of evolution like that of the heavenly bodies according to Laplace, and the plants and animals of our globe, according to Lamarck, Darwin, and Wallace. In the general array of the elements, as known to us, we have seen a striking approximation to that of the organic world. In lack of direct evidence of the decomposition of any element, we have sought and found indirect evidence. We have next glanced at the view of the genesis of the elements, and lastly we have reviewed a scheme of their origin suggested by Professor Reynolds's method of illustrating the periodic classification. Summing up all the above considerations, we cannot, indeed, venture to assert positively that our so-called elements have been evolved from one primordial matter, but we may contend that the balance of evidence, I think, fairly weighs in favor of this speculation. Thus inductive science, in its branches of astronomy, physics, and chemistry, while advancing timidly towards the conquest of nature's secrets and her final effects on our terrestrial plane, recedes to the days of Anaxagoras and the Chaldees, in its discoveries of a. the origin of our phenomenal world, and b. the modes of formation of the bodies that compose the universe. And having, for their cosmogonical hypotheses, to turn back to the beliefs of the earliest philosophers, and the systems of the latter systems, that were all based on the teachings of a universal secret doctrine, with regard to primeval matter, with its properties, functions, and laws, have we not the right to hope that the day is not far off when science will show a better appreciation of the wisdom of the ancients than it has hitherto done? No doubt occult philosophy could learn a good deal from exact modern science, but the latter, on the other hand, might profit by ancient learning in more than one way, and chiefly in cosmogony. It might learn, for instance, the mystical signification, alchemical and transcendental, of the many imponderable substances that fill interplanetary space, and which, interpenetrating each, are the direct cause, at the lower end, of the production of natural phenomena, manifesting through so-called vibration. The knowledge of the real, not the hypothetical, nature of ether, or rather of the Akasha, and other mysteries, in short, can alone lead to the knowledge of forces. It is that substance against which the materialistic school of the physicists rebels with such fury, especially in France, and which exact science has to advocate notwithstanding. They cannot make away with it without incurring the risk of pulling down the pillars of the temple of science, like a modern Samson, and of getting buried under its roof. The theories built upon the rejection of force, outside and independent of matter pure and simple, have all been shown to be fallacious. They do not, and cannot, cover the ground, and many of the scientific data are thus proved to be unscientific. Ether-produced sound is said in the Puranas, and the statement is laughed at. Sound is the result of the vibrations of the air, we are corrected. And what is air? Could it exist if there were no etheric medium in space to buoy up its molecules? The case stands simply thus. Materialism cannot admit the existence of anything outside matter, because with the acceptance of an imponderable force, the source and head of all the physical forces, other intelligent forces would have to be virtually admitted, and that would lead science very far. For it would have to accept as a sequel the presence in man of a still more spiritual power entirely independent, for once, of any kind of matter about which physicists know anything. Hence, apart from a hypothetical ether of space and gross physical bodies, the whole sidereal and unseen space is, in the sight of materialists, one boundless void in nature, blind, unintelligent, useless. And now the next question is, what is that cosmic substance, and how far can one go in suspecting its nature or in wrenching from it its secrets, thus feeling justified in giving it a name? How far, especially, has modern science gone in the direction of those secrets, and what is it doing to solve them? The latest hobby of science, the nebular theory, may afford us some answer to this question. Let us then examine the credentials of this nebular theory. Scientific and esoteric evidence for, and objections to, the modern nebular theory. Of late, esoteric cosmogony has been frequently opposed by the phantom of this theory and its ensuing hypotheses. Can this most scientific teaching be denied by your adepts? It is asked. Not entirely is the reply, but the admissions of the men of science themselves kill it, and there remains nothing for the adepts to deny. To make of science an integral whole necessitates, indeed, the study of spiritual and psychic, as well as of physical, nature. Otherwise it will ever be like the anatomy of man, discussed of old by the profane from the point of view of his shell side, and in ignorance of the interior work. Even Plato, the greatest philosopher of his country, was guilty, before his initiation, of such statements as that liquids pass into the stomach through the lungs. Without metaphysics, as Mr. H. J. Slack says, real science is inadmissible. The nebulae exist, yet the nebular theory is wrong. A nebula exists in a state of entire elemental dissociation. It is gaseous and something else besides, which can hardly be connected with gases as these are known to physical science, and it is self-luminous. But that is all. The 62 coincidences enumerated by Professor Stephen Alexander, confirming the nebular theory, may all be explained by esoteric science, though, as this is not an astronomical work, the refutations are not attempted at present. Laplace and Fay come nearer to the correct theory than any, but of the speculations of Laplace, there remains little in the present theory beyond its general features. Nevertheless, says John Stuart Mill, there is in Laplace's theory nothing hypothetical, it is an example of legitimate reasoning from present effect to its past cause. it assumes nothing more than that objects which really exist obey the laws which are known to be obeyed by all terrestrial objects resembling them. From such an eminent logician as was Mill, this would be valuable if it could only be proved that terrestrial objects resembling celestial objects at such a distance as are the nebulae resemble those objects in reality and not only in appearance. Another of the fallacies, from the occult standpoint, embodied in the modern theory as it now stands, is the hypothesis that the planets were all detached from the Sun, that they are bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh, whereas the Sun and the planets are only co-uterine brothers, having the same nebular origin, but in a different mode from that postulated by modern astronomy. The many objections raised by some opponents of the modern nebular theory against the homogeneity of original diffuse matter, on the ground of the uniformity in the composition of the fixed stars, do not affect the question of that homogeneity at all, but only the theory itself. Our solar nebula may not be completely homogeneous, or, rather, it may fail to reveal itself as such to the astronomers, and yet be de facto homogeneous. The stars do differ in their constituent materials, and even exhibit elements quite unknown on Earth. Nevertheless, this does not affect the point that primeval matter as it appeared even in its first differentiation from its Laya condition is yet to this day homogeneous, at immense distances, in the depths of infinitude, and likewise at points not far removed from the outskirts of our solar system. Finally, there does not exist one single fact brought forward by the learned objectors against the nebular theory, false as it is, and hence, illogically enough, fatal to the hypothesis of the homogeneity of matter, that can withstand criticism. One error leads to another. A false premise will naturally lead to a false conclusion, although an inadmissible inference does not necessarily affect the validity of the major proposition of the syllogism. Thus, one may leave every side issue and inference from the evidence of spectra and lines as simply provisional for the present and abandon all matters of detail to physical science. The duty of the occultist lies with the soul and spirit of cosmic space, not merely with its elusive appearance and behavior. That of official physical science is to analyze and study its shell, the ultima thule of the universe and man, in the opinion of materialism. With the latter, occultism has naught to do. It is only with the theories of such men of learning as Kepler, Kant, Ørsted, and Sir William Herschel, who believed in a spiritual world, that occult cosmogony might treat and attempt a satisfactory compromise. But the views of those physicists differed vastly from the latest modern speculations. Kant and Herschel had in their mind's eye speculations upon the origin and the final destiny, as well as upon the present aspect of the universe, from a far more philosophical and psychic standpoint, whereas modern cosmology and astronomy now repudiate anything like research into the mysteries of being. The result is what might be expected. Complete failure and inextricable contradictions in the 1001 varieties of so-called scientific theories, and in this theory as in all others. The nebular hypothesis, involving the theory of the existence of a primeval matter, diffused in a nebulous condition, is of no modern date in astronomy, as everyone knows. Anaximenes, of the Ionian school, had already taught that the sidereal bodies were formed through the progressive condensation of a primordial pregenetic matter, which had almost a negative weight, and was spread out through space in an extremely sublimated condition. Tycho Brahe, who viewed the Milky Way as an ethereal substance, thought the new star that appeared in Cassiopeia in 1572 had been formed out of that matter. Kepler believed that the star of 1606 had likewise been formed out of the ethereal substance that fills the universe. He attributed to that same ether the apparition of a luminous ring round the moon during the total eclipse of the sun observed at Naples in 1605. Still later, in 1714, the existence of a self-luminous matter was recognized by Halley in the Philosophical Transactions. Finally, the journal of this name published in 1811 the famous hypothesis of the eminent astronomer, Sir William Herschel, on the transformation of the nebulae into stars, and after this the nebular theory was accepted by the Royal Academies. In 5 years of Theosophy, may be read an article headed, "Do the Adepts Deny the Nebular Theory?" The answer there given is no, they do not deny its general propositions, nor the approximative truth of the scientific hypotheses. They only deny the completeness of the present, as well as the entire error of the many so-called exploded old theories, which, during the last century, have followed each other in such rapid succession. This was asserted at the time to be an evasive answer. Such disrespect to official science, it was argued, must be justified by the replacement of the orthodox speculation by another theory more complete and having a firmer ground to stand upon. To this there is but one reply. It is useless to give out isolated theories with regard to things embodied in a complete and consecutive system, for, when separated from the main body of the teaching, they would necessarily lose their vital coherence and would thus do no good when studied independently. To be able to appreciate and accept the occult views on the nebular theory, we must study the whole esoteric cosmogonical system. And the time has hardly arrived for the astronomers to be asked to accept Fohit and the divine builders. Even the undeniably correct surmises of Sir William Herschel, which had nothing supernatural in them, as to the sun's being called a globe of fire perhaps metaphorically, and his early speculations about the nature of that which is now called the Nasmyth willow leaf theory, only caused that most eminent of all astronomers to be smiled at by other, far less eminent colleagues, who saw and now see in his ideas purely imaginative and fanciful theories. Before the whole esoteric system could be given out and appreciated by the astronomers, the latter would have to return to some of those antiquated ideas, not only to those of Herschel, but also to the dreams of the oldest Hindu astronomers, and thus abandon their own theories, which are none the less fanciful, because they have appeared nearly 80 years later than the one, and many thousands of years later than the others. Foremost of all, they would have to repudiate their ideas of the sun's solidity and incandescence, the sun glowing most undeniably, but not burning. Then the occultists state, with regard to the willow leaves, that those objects, as Sir William Herschel called them, are the immediate sources of the solar light and heat. And though the esoteric teaching does not regard these as he did, namely, as organisms partaking of the nature of life, for the solar beings will hardly place themselves within telescopic focus yet, it asserts that the whole universe is full of such organisms, conscious and active, according to the proximity or distance of their planes to, or from, our plane of consciousness, and finally that the great astronomer was right while speculating on those supposed organisms, in saying that we do not know that vital action is incompetent to develop at once heat, light, and electricity. 4. At the risk of being laughed at by the whole world of physicists, The occultists maintain that all the forces of the scientists have their origin in the vital principle, the one life collectively of our solar system, that life being a portion, or rather one of the aspects, of the one universal life. We may, therefore, as in the article under consideration, wherein, on the authority of the adepts, it was maintained that it is sufficient to make a resume of what the solar physicists do not know, we maintain, define our position with regard to the modern nebular theory and its evident incorrectness by simply pointing out facts diametrically opposed to it in its present form. And to begin with, what does it teach? Summarizing the aforesaid hypotheses, it becomes plain that Laplace's theory, now made quite unrecognizable, moreover was an unfortunate one. He postulates in the first place cosmic matter, existing in a state of diffuse nebulosity so fine that its presence could hardly have been suspected. No attempt is made by him to penetrate into the arcana of being, except as regards the immediate evolution of our small solar system. Consequently, whether one accepts or rejects his theory and its bearing upon the immediate cosmological problems presented for solution, he can only be said to have thrown back the mystery a little further. To the eternal query, whence matter itself, whence the evolutionary impetus determining its cyclic aggregations and dissolutions, whence the exquisite symmetry and order into which the primeval atoms arrange and group themselves? No answer is attempted by Laplace. All we are confronted with is a sketch of the probable broad principles on which the actual process is assumed to be based. Well, and what is this now celebrated note on the said process? What has he given so wonderfully new and original that its groundwork, at any rate, should have served as a basis for the modern nebular theory? The following is what one gathers from various astronomical works. Laplace thought that, in consequence of the condensation of the atoms of the primeval nebula, according to the law of gravity, the now gaseous, or perhaps partially liquid mass, acquired a rotatory motion. As the velocity of this rotation increased, it assumed the form of a thin disk. Finally, the centrifugal force overpowering that of cohesion, huge rings were detached from the edge of the whirling incandescent masses, and these rings contracted necessarily by gravitation, as accepted, into spheroidal bodies, which would necessarily still continue to preserve the orbit previously occupied by the outer zone from which they were separated. The velocity of the outer edge of each nascent planet, he said, exceeding that of the inner, there results a rotation on its axis. The more dense bodies would be thrown off last, and finally, during the preliminary state of their formation, the newly segregated orbs in their turn throw off one or more satellites. In formulating the history of the rupture and planetation of rings, Laplace says, almost always each ring of vapors must have broken up into numerous masses, which, moving with a nearly uniform velocity, must have continued to circulate at the same distance around the Sun. These masses must have taken a spheroidal form with a motion of rotation in the same direction as their revolution, since the inner molecules, those nearest the Sun, would have less actual velocity than the exterior ones. They must then have formed as many planets in a state of vapor. But, if one of them was sufficiently powerful to unite successively, by its attraction, all the others around its center, the ring of vapors, must have been thus transformed into a single spheroidal mass of vapors circulating around the Sun, with a rotation in the same direction as its revolution. The latter case has been the more common, but the solar system presents us the first case, in the 4 small planets which move between Jupiter and Mars. While few will be found to deny the magnificent audacity of this hypothesis, it is impossible not to recognize the insurmountable difficulties with which it is attended. Why, for instance, do we find that the satellites of Neptune and Uranus display a retrograde motion? Why, in spite of its closer proximity to the Sun, is Venus less dense than the Earth? Why, again, is the more distant Uranus denser than Saturn? How is it that there are so many variations in the inclination of their axes and orbits in the supposed progeny of the central orb, that such startling variations in the size of the planets are noticeable, that the satellites of Jupiter are more dense by 288 than their primary, that the phenomena of meteoric and cometary systems still remain unaccounted for? To quote the words of a master, the adepts find that the centrifugal theory of Western birth is unable to cover all the ground. That, unaided, it can neither account for every oblate spheroid, nor explain away such evident difficulties as are presented by the relative density of some planets. How, indeed, can any calculation of centrifugal force explain to us, for instance, why Mercury, whose rotation is, we are told, only about 1/3 that of the Earth, and its density only about 1/4 greater than the Earth, should have a polar compression more than 10 times greater than the latter? And again, why Jupiter, whose equatorial rotation is said to be 27 times greater, and its density only about 1/5 that of the Earth, should have its polar compression 17 times greater than that of the Earth? Or why Saturn, with an equatorial velocity 55 times greater than Mercury for centripetal force to contend with, should have its polar compression only 3 times greater than Mercury's? To crown the above contradictions, we are asked to believe in the central forces as taught by modern science, even when told that the equatorial matter of the Sun, with more than 4 times the centrifugal velocity of the Earth's equatorial surface, and only about 1/4 part of the gravitation of the equatorial matter, has not manifested any tendency to bulge at the solar equator, nor shown the least flattening at the poles of the solar axis. In other and clearer words, the Sun, with only 1/4 of our Earth's density for the centrifugal force to work upon, has no polar compression at all. We find this objection made by more than one astronomer, yet never explained away satisfactorily, so far as the adepts are aware. Therefore, do they, the adepts, say that the great men of science of the West, knowing next to nothing either about cometary matter, centrifugal and centripetal forces, the nature of the nebulae, or the physical constitution of the Sun, the stars, or even the Moon, are imprudent to speak so confidently as they do about the central mass of the Sun, whirling out into space planets, comets, and what not? We maintain that the Sun evolves out only the life principle, the soul of these bodies, giving and receiving it back, in our little solar system, as the universal life giver in the infinitude and eternity, that the solar system is as much the microcosm of the one macrocosm as man is the former, when compared with his own little solar cosmos. The essential power of all the cosmic and terrestrial elements to generate within themselves a regular and harmonious series of results, a concatenation of causes and effects, is an irrefutable proof that they are either animated by an intelligence, ab extra or ab intra, or conceal such within or behind a manifested veil. Occultism does not deny the certainty of the mechanical origin of the universe, It only claims the absolute necessity of mechanicians of some sort behind or within those elements, a dogma with us. It is not the fortuitous assistance of the atoms of Lucretius, as he himself knew well, that built the cosmos and all in it. Nature herself contradicts such a theory. Celestial space, containing matter so attenuated as ether, cannot be called on, with or without attraction, to explain the common motion of the sidereal hosts. Although the perfect accord of their inter-revolution indicates clearly the presence of a mechanical cause in nature, Newton, who of all men had most right to trust to his deductions, was nevertheless forced to abandon the idea of ever explaining the original impulse given to the millions of orbs by merely the laws of known nature and its material forces. He recognized fully the limits that separate the action of natural forces from that of the intelligences that set the immutable laws in order and action. And if a Newton had to renounce such hope, which of the modern materialistic pygmies has the right of saying, "I know better"? A cosmogonical theory, to become complete and comprehensible, has to start with a primordial substance diffused throughout boundless space, of an intellectual and divine nature. That substance must be the soul and spirit, the synthesis and seventh principle of the manifested cosmos, and, to serve as a spiritual upadhi to this, there must be the sixth, its vehicle, primordial physical matter, so to speak, though its nature must escape forever our limited normal senses. It is easy for an astronomer, if endowed with an imaginative faculty, to build a theory of the emergence of the universe out of chaos by simply applying to it the principles of mechanics. But such a universe will always prove a Frankenstein's monster with respect to its scientific human creator. It will lead him into endless perplexities. The application of mechanical laws only can never carry the speculator beyond the objective world, nor will it unveil to men the origin and final destiny of cosmos. This is whither the nebular theory has led science. In sober fact and truth, this theory is twin sister to that of ether, and both are the offspring of necessity. One is as indispensable to account for the transmission of light as is the other to explain the problem of the origin of the solar systems. The question with science is how the same homogeneous matter could, obeying the laws of Newton, give birth to bodies, sun, planets, and their satellites subject to conditions of identity of motion and formed of such heterogeneous elements. Has the nebular theory helped to solve the problem, even if applied solely to bodies considered as inanimate and material? We say, most decidedly not. What progress has it made since 1811, when first Sir William Herschel's paper, with its facts based on observation and showing the existence of nebular matter, made the sons of the Royal Society shout for joy? Since then, a still greater discovery, through spectrum analysis, has permitted the verification and corroboration of Sir William Herschel's conjecture. Laplace demanded some kind of primitive world stuff to prove the idea of progressive world evolution and growth. Here it is, as offered 2 millenniums ago. The world stuff, now called nebulae, was known from the highest antiquity. Anaxagoras taught that, upon differentiation, the resulting commixture of heterogeneous substances remained motionless and unorganized, until finally the mind, a collective body of Dian-Chohans, we say, began to work upon, and communicated to, the motion and order. This theory is now taken up, so far as concerns its first portion, the last, that of any mind interfering, being rejected. Spectrum analysis reveals the existence of nebulae formed entirely of gases and luminous vapors. Is this the primitive nebular matter? The spectra reveal, it is said, the physical conditions of the matter which emits cosmic light. The spectra of the resolvable and the irresolvable nebulae are shown to be entirely different, the spectra of the latter showing their physical state to be that of glowing gas or vapor. The bright lines of one nebula reveal the existence of hydrogen and of other material substances known and unknown. The same is to the atmospheres of the sun and stars. This leads to the direct inference that a star is formed by the condensation of a nebula, hence that even the metals themselves are formed on Earth by the condensation of hydrogen or of some other primitive matter, some ancestral cousin to helium, perhaps, or some yet unknown stuff. This does not clash with the occult teachings. And this is the problem that chemistry is trying to solve, and it must succeed sooner or later in the task, accepting nolens volens, when it does, the esoteric teaching. But when this does happen, it will kill the nebular theory as it now stands. Meanwhile, astronomy cannot accept in any way, if it is to be regarded as an exact science, the present theory of the filiation of stars, even if occultism does so in its own way, seeing that it explains this filiation differently because astronomy has not one single physical datum to show for it. Astronomy could anticipate chemistry in proving the existence of the fact, if it could show a planetary nebula exhibiting a spectrum of 3 or 4 bright lines, gradually condensing and transforming into a star, with a spectrum all covered with a number of dark lines. But the question of the variability of the nebulae, even as to their form, is yet one of the mysteries of astronomy. The data of observation possessed so far are of too recent an origin, too uncertain, to permit us to affirm anything. Since its discovery, the magic power of the spectroscope has revealed to its adepts only one single transformation of a star of this kind, and even that showed directly the reverse of what is needed as proof in favor of the nebular theory, for it revealed a star transforming itself into a planetary nebula. As related in the observatory, the temporary star, discovered by J. Schmidt in the constellation Cygnus in November 1876, exhibited a spectrum broken by very brilliant lines. Gradually, the continuous spectrum and most of the lines disappeared, leaving finally one single brilliant line, which appeared to coincide with the green line of the nebula. Though this metamorphosis is not irreconcilable with the hypothesis of the nebular origin of the stars, nevertheless this single solitary case rests on no observation whatever, least of all on direct observation. The occurrence may have been due to several other causes. Since astronomers are inclined to think our planets are tending toward precipitation into the sun, why should not that star have blazed up owing to a collision of such precipitated planets, or, as many suggest, the apples of a comet? Be that as it may, the only known instance of star transformation since 1811 is not favorable to the nebular theory. Moreover, on the question of this theory, as on all others, astronomers disagree. In our own age, and before Laplace ever thought of it, Buffon, being very much struck by the identity of motion in the planets, was the first to propose the hypothesis that the planets and their satellites originated in the bosom of the sun. Forthwith and for this purpose, he invented a special comet, supposed to have torn out, by a powerful oblique blow, the quantity of matter necessary for their formation. Laplace gave its dues to the comet in his exposition du système du monde. But the idea was seized and even improved upon by a conception of the alternate evolution, from the Sun's central mass, of planets apparently without weight or influence on the motion of the visible planets and, as evidently without any more existence than the likeness of Moses in the moon. But the modern theory is also a variation on the systems elaborated by Kant and Laplace. The idea of both was that, at the origin of things, all that matter which now enters into the composition of the planetary bodies was spread over all the space comprised in the solar system and even beyond. It was a nebula of extremely small density, and its condensation gradually gave birth, by a mechanism that has hitherto never been explained, to the various bodies of our system. This is the original nebular theory, an incomplete yet faithful repetition, a short chapter out of the large volume of Universal Esoteric Cosmogony of the Teachings of the Secret Doctrine. And both systems, Kant's and Laplace's, differ greatly from the modern theory, redundant with conflicting sub-theories and fanciful hypotheses. Say the teachers. The essence of cometary matter and of that which composes the stars is totally different from any of the chemical or physical characteristics with which the greatest chemists and physicists of the earth are familiar. While the spectroscope has shown the probable similarity owing to the chemical action of terrestrial light upon the intercepted rays of terrestrial and sidereal substance, the chemical actions peculiar to the variously progressed orbs of space have not been detected, nor proven to be identical with those observed on our own planet. Mr. Crookes says almost the same in the fragment quoted from his lecture, Elements and Meta-Elements. C. Wolf, member of the Institute, astronomer of the Observatory, Paris, observes, at the utmost the nebular hypothesis can only show in its favor, with W. Herschel, the existence of planetary nebulae in various degrees of condensation, and of spiral nebulae, with nuclei of condensation on the branches and center. But, in fact, the knowledge of the bond that unites the nebulae to the stars is yet denied to us, and lacking as we do direct observation, we are even debarred from establishing it on the analogy of chemical composition. Even if the men of science, leaving aside the difficulty arising out of such undeniable variety and heterogeneity of matter in the constitution of nebulae, did admit, with the ancients, that the origin of all the visible and invisible heavenly bodies must be sought for in one primordial homogeneous world stuff, in a kind of pre-protyle, it is evident that this would not put an end to their perplexities. Unless they admit also that our actual visible universe is merely the sthula sharira, the gross body, of the sevenfold cosmos, they will have to face another problem, especially if they venture to maintain that its now visible bodies are the result of the condensation of that one and single primordial matter. For mere observation shows them that the operations which produce the actual universe are far more complex than could ever be embraced in that theory. First of all, there are two distinct classes of irresolvable nebulae, as science itself teaches. The telescope is unable to distinguish between these two classes, but the spectroscope can do so, and notices an essential difference between their physical constitutions. The question of the resolvability of the nebulae has been often presented in too affirmative a manner, and quite contrary to the ideas expressed by the illustrious experimenter with the spectra of these constellations, Mr. Huggins. Every nebula whose spectrum contains only bright lines is gaseous, it is said, and hence is irresolvable. Every nebula with a continuous spectrum must end by resolving into stars with an instrument of sufficient power. This assumption is contrary at once to the results obtained and to spectroscopic theory. The Lyra Nebula, the Dumbbell Nebula, the central region of the Nebula of Orion, appear resolvable and show a spectrum of bright lines. The nebula of Canes Venatici is not resolvable and gives a continuous spectrum. Because, indeed, the spectroscope informs us of the physical state of the constituent matter of the stars, but affords us no notions of their modes of aggregation. A nebula formed of gaseous globes, or even of nuclei, faintly luminous, surrounded by a powerful atmosphere, would give a spectrum of lines and be still resolvable. Such seems to be the state of Huygens region in the Orion Nebula. A nebula formed of solid or fluidic particles in a state of incandescence, a true cloud, will give a continuous spectrum and will be irresolvable. Some of these nebulae, Wolf tells us, have a spectrum of 3 or 4 bright lines, others a continuous spectrum. The first are gaseous, the others formed of a pulverulent matter. The former must constitute a veritable atmosphere. It is among these that the solar nebula of Laplace has to be placed. The latter form an ensemble of particles that may be considered as independent, and the rotation of which obeys the laws of internal weight. Such are the nebulae adopted by Kant and Faye. Observation allows us to place the one as the other at the very origin of the planetary world. But when we try to go beyond an ascent to the primitive chaos which has produced the totality of the heavenly bodies, we have first to account for the actual existence of these two classes of nebulae. If the primitive chaos were a cold luminous gas, one could understand how the contraction resulting from attraction could have heated it and made it luminous. We have to explain the condensation of this gas to the state of incandescent particles, the presence of which is revealed to us in certain nebulae by the spectroscope. If the original chaos was composed of such particles, how did certain of their portions pass into the gaseous state, while others have preserved their primitive condition? Such is the synopsis of the objections and difficulties in the way of the acceptance of the nebular theory, brought forward by the French savant, who concludes this interesting argument by declaring that the first part of the cosmogonical problem, what is the primitive matter of chaos, and how did that matter give birth to the sun and stars, thus remains to this day in the domain of romance and of mere imagination. If this is the last word of science upon the subject, whither then should we turn in order to learn what the nebular theory is supposed to teach? What, in fact, is this theory? What it is, no one seems to know for certain. What it is not we learn from the erudite author of World Life. He tells us that it is not a theory of the evolution of the universe. It is primarily a genetic explanation of the phenomena of the solar system, and accessorily a coordination in a common conception of the principal phenomena in the stellar and nebular firmament, as far as human vision has been able to penetrate. It does not regard the comets as involved in that particular evolution which has produced the solar system. The esoteric doctrine does, because it, too, recognizes the comets as forms of cosmic existence coordinated with earlier stages of nebular evolution, and it actually assigns to them chiefly the formation of all worlds. It does not deny an antecedent history of the luminous fire mist, the secondary stage of evolution, in the secret doctrine, and makes no claim to having reached an absolute beginning. And even it allows that this fire mist may have previously existed in a cold, non-luminous and invisible condition, and that finally it does not profess to discover the origin of things, but only a stadium in material history, leaving the philosopher and the theologian as free as they ever were to seek the origin of the modes of being. But this is not all. Even the greatest philosopher of England, Mr. Herbert Spencer, arrayed himself against this fantastic theory by saying that a. the problem of existence is not resolved by it, b. the nebular hypothesis throws no light upon the origin of diffused matter, and c. that the nebular hypothesis, as it now stands, implies a first cause. The latter, we are afraid, is more than our modern physicists have bargained for. Thus, it seems that the poor hypothesis can hardly expect to find help or corroboration even in the world of the metaphysicians. Considering all this, the occultists believe they have a right to present their philosophy, however misunderstood and ostracized it may be at present. And they maintain that this failure of the scientists to discover the truth is entirely due to their materialism and their contempt for transcendental sciences. Yet although the scientific minds in our century are as far from the true and correct doctrine of evolution as ever, there may be still some hope left for the future, for even now we find another scientist giving us a faint glimmer of it. In an article in the Popular Science Review on recent researches in Minute Life, we find Mr. H.J. Slack saying, "There is an evident convergence of all sciences, from physics to chemistry and physiology, toward some doctrine of evolution and development, of which the facts of Darwinism will form part, but what ultimate aspect this doctrine will take, there is little, if any, evidence to show, and perhaps it will not be shaped by the human mind until metaphysical as well as physical inquiries are much more advanced." This is a happy forecast indeed. The day may come, then, when natural selection as taught by Mr. Darwin and Mr. Herbert Spencer will, in its ultimate modification, form only a part of our Eastern doctrine of evolution, which will be Manu and Kapila esoterically explained. Forces, modes of motion, or intelligences? This is, then, the last word of physical science up to the present year, 1888. Mechanical laws will never be able to prove the homogeneity of primeval matter, except inferentially and as a desperate necessity, when there will remain no other issue as in the case of ether. Modern science is secure only in its own domain and region, within the physical boundaries of our solar system, beyond which everything, every particle of matter, is different from the matter it knows, and where matter exists in states of which science can form no idea. This matter, which is truly homogeneous, is beyond human perception, if perception is tied down merely to the five senses. We feel its effects through those intelligences which are the results of its primeval differentiation, whom we name Dayan Chohans, called in the Hermetic works the seven governors, those to whom Pymander, the thought divine, refers as the building powers, and whom Asclepios calls the supernal gods. This matter, the real primordial substance, the noumenon of all the matter we know of, some of our astronomers even have been led to believe in, for they despair of the possibility of ever accounting for rotation, gravitation, and the origin of any mechanical physical laws, unless these intelligences be admitted by science. In the above-quoted work upon astronomy by Wolff, the author endorses fully the theory of Kant, and the latter theory, if not in its general aspect, at any rate in some of its features, reminds one strongly of certain esoteric teachings. Here we have the world system reborn from its ashes through a nebula, the emanation from the bodies, dead and dissolved in space, resultant of the incandescence of the solar center reanimated, by the combustible matter of the planets. In this theory, generated and developed in the brain of a young man hardly 25 years of age, who had never left his native place, Königsberg, a small town of northern Prussia, one can hardly fail to recognize either the presence of an inspiring external power or an evidence of the reincarnation which the occultists see in it. It fills a gap which Newton, with all his genius, failed to bridge. And surely it is our primeval matter, Akasha, that Kant had in view when he postulated a universally pervading primordial substance in order to solve Newton's difficulty and his failure to explain, by natural forces alone, the primitive impulse imparted to the planets. For, as he remarks in Chapter 8, if it is once admitted that the perfect harmony of the stars and planets and the coincidence of their orbital planes prove the existence of a natural cause, which would thus be the primal cause, that cause cannot really be the matter which fills today the heavenly spaces. It must be that which filled space was space originally, whose motion and differentiated matter was the origin of the actual movements of the sidereal bodies, and which, in condensing itself in those very bodies, thus abandoned the space that is today found void. In other words, it is of that same matter that are now compassed the planets, comets, and the sun himself, and that matter, having originally formed itself into those bodies, has preserved its inherent quality of motion, which quality, now centered in their nuclei, directs all motion. A very slight alteration of words in this is needed, and a few additions, to make of it our esoteric doctrine. The latter teaches that it is this original, primordial prima materia, divine and intelligent, the direct emanation of the universal mind, the Diviprakriti, the divine light emanating from the logos which form the nuclei of all the self-moving orbs in cosmos. It is the informing, ever-present moving power and life principle, the vital soul of the suns, moons, planets, and even of our earth, the former latent, the latter active, the invisible ruler and guide of the gross body attached to, and connected with, its soul, which is the spiritual emanation, after all, of these respective planetary spirits. Another quite occult doctrine is the theory of Kant, that the matter of which the inhabitants and the animals of other planets are formed is of a lighter and more subtle nature, and of a more perfect conformation, in proportion to their distance from the sun. The latter is too full of vital electricity, of the physical, life-giving principle. Therefore, the men on Mars are more ethereal than we are, while those on Venus are more gross, though far more intelligent, if less spiritual. The last doctrine is not quite ours, yet these Kantian theories are as metaphysical and as transcendental as any occult doctrines, and more than one man of science would, if he but dared speak his mind, accept them as Wolff does. From this Kantian mind and soul of the suns and stars to the Mahat, mind, and Prakriti of the Puranas, there is but a step. After all, the admission of this by science would be only the admission of a natural cause, whether it would or would not stretch its belief to such metaphysical heights. But then Mahat, the mind, is a god, and physiology admits mind only as a temporary function of the material brain, and no more. The Satan of materialism now laughs at all alike, and denies the visible as well as the invisible. Seeing in light, heat, electricity, and even in the phenomenon of life, only properties inherent in matter, it laughs whenever life is called the vital principle, and derides the idea of its being independent of and distinct from the organism. But here again scientific opinions differ as in everything else, and there are several men of science who accept views very similar to ours. Consider, for instance, what Dr. Richardson, FRS, elsewhere quoted at length, says of that vital principle which he calls nervous ether. I speak only of a veritable material agent, refined, it may be, to the world at large, but actual and substantial. An agent having quality of weight and of volume, an agent susceptible of chemical combination, and thereby of change of physical state and condition, an agent passive in its action, moved always, that is to say, by influences apart from itself, obeying other influences, an agent possessing no initiative power, no vis or energia naturae, but still playing a most important, if not a primary part in the production of the phenomena resulting from the action of the energia upon visible matter. As biology and physiology now deny, in toto, the existence of a vital principle, this extract, together with de Quatrefages' admission, is a clear confirmation that there are men of science who take the same views about things occult as do theosophists and occultists. These recognize a distinct vital principle independent of the organism material, of course, as physical force cannot be divorced from matter, but of a substance existing in a state unknown to science. Life for them is something more than the mere interaction of molecules and atoms. There is a vital principle without which no molecular combinations could ever have resulted in a living organism, least of all in the so-called inorganic matter of our plane of consciousness. By molecular combinations are meant, of course, those of the matter of our present illusive perceptions, which matter energizes only on this, our plane. And this is the chief point at issue. Thus the occultists are not alone in their beliefs. Nor are they so foolish, after all, in rejecting even the gravity of modern science along with other physical laws, and in accepting instead attraction and repulsion. They see, moreover, in these two opposite forces, only the two aspects of the universal unit, called manifesting mind, in which aspects, occultism, through its great seers, perceives an innumerable host of operative beings, cosmic Dayan-Chohans, entities, whose essence, in its dual nature, is the cause of all terrestrial phenomena. For that essence is consubstantial with the universal electric ocean, which is life, and being dual, as said positive and negative, it is the emanations of that duality that act now on earth under the name of modes of motion, even force having now become objectionable as a word, for fear it should lead someone, even in thought, to separate it from matter. It is, as occultism says, the dual effects of that dual essence, which have now been called centripetal and centrifugal forces, now negative and positive poles, or polarity, heat and cold, light and darkness. And it is further maintained that even the Greek and Roman Catholic Christians are wiser in believing, as they do even if blindly connecting and tracing them all to an anthropomorphic God in angels, archangels, archons, seraphs, and morning stars, in all those theological delicii humani generis, in short, that ruled the cosmic elements, than science is, in disbelieving in them altogether, and in advocating its mechanical forces. For these act very often with more than human intelligence and pertinency. Nevertheless, that intelligence is denied and attributed to blind chance. But, as de Maistre was right in calling the law of gravitation merely a word which replaced the thing unknown, so are we right in applying the same remark to all the other forces of science. And if it is objected that the Count was an ardent Roman Catholic, then we may cite Le Couturier, as ardent a materialist, who said the same thing, as did also Herschel and many others. From gods to men, from worlds to atoms, from a star to a rushlight, from the sun to the vital heat of the meanest organic being, the world of form and existence is an immense chain, the links of which are all connected. The law of analogy is the first key to the world problem, and these links have to be studied coordinately in their occult relations to each other. When, therefore, the secret doctrine postulating that conditioned or limited space, location, has no real being except in this world of illusion, or, in other words, in our perceptive faculties, teaches that every one of the higher, as of the lower worlds, is interblended with our own objective world, that millions of things and beings are, in point of localization, around and in us, as we are around, with, and in them. This is no mere metaphysical figure of speech, but a sober fact in nature, however incomprehensible to our senses. But one has to understand the phraseology of occultism before criticizing what it asserts. For example, the doctrine refuses, as science does, in one sense to use the words above and below, higher and lower, in reference to invisible spheres, since here they are without meaning. Even the terms East and West are merely conventional, necessary only to aid our human perceptions. For though the Earth has its two fixed points in the poles, north and south, yet both East and West are variable relatively to our own position on the Earth's surface, and in consequence of its rotation from west to east. Hence, when other worlds are mentioned, whether better or worse, more spiritual or still more material, though both invisible, the occultist does not locate these spheres either outside or inside our Earth, as the theologians and the poets do, for their location is nowhere in the space known to, or conceived by, the profane. They are, as it were, blended with our world, interpenetrating it and interpenetrated by it. There are millions and millions of worlds and firmaments visible to us. There are still greater numbers beyond those visible to the telescope, and many of the latter kind do not belong to our objective sphere of existence. Although as invisible as if they were millions of miles beyond our solar system, they are yet with us, near us, within our own world, as objective and material to their respective inhabitants as ours is to us. But, again, the relation of these worlds to ours is not that of a series of egg-shaped boxes enclosed one within the other, like the toys called Chinese nests. Each is entirely under its own special laws and conditions, having no direct relation to our sphere. The inhabitants of these, as already said, may be, for all we know or feel, passing through and around us as if through empty space, their very habitations and countries being interblended with ours, though not disturbing our vision, because we have not yet the faculties necessary for discerning them. Yet by their spiritual sight the adepts, and even some seers and sensitives, are always able to discern, whether in a greater or smaller degree, the presence and close proximity to us of beings pertaining to other spheres of life. Those of the spiritually higher worlds communicate only with those terrestrial mortals who ascend to them, through individual efforts, onto the higher plane they are occupying. The sons of Bhumi Earth regard the sons of Deva Loka's angel spheres as their gods, and the sons of lower kingdoms look up to the men of Bhumi as to their Devas gods, men remaining unaware of it in their blindness. They men tremble before them while using them for magical purposes. The first race of men were the mind-born sons of the former. They, the Pitras and Devas, are our progenitors. Educated people, so-called, deride the idea of sylphs, salamanders, undines, and gnomes, The men of science regard any mention of such superstitions as an insult, and with a contempt of logic and common good sense that is often the prerogative of accepted authority, they allow those whom it is their duty to instruct to labor under the absurd impression that in the whole cosmos, or at any rate in our own atmosphere, there are no other conscious, intelligent beings save ourselves. Any other humanity, composed of distinct human beings, save a mankind with 2 legs, 2 arms, and a head with man's features on it, would not be called human, though the etymology of the word would seem to have little to do with the general appearance of a creature. Thus, while science sternly rejects even the possibility of there being such, to us, generally, invisible creatures, society, while believing in it all secretly, is made to deride the idea openly. It hails with mirth such works as the Comte Gabellus, and fails to understand that open satire is the securest mask. Nevertheless, such invisible worlds do exist. Inhabited as thickly as is our own, they are scattered throughout apparent space in immense numbers, some far more material than our own world, others gradually etherealizing until they become formless and are as breaths. The fact that our physical eye does not see them is no reason for disbelieving in them. Physicists cannot see their ether atoms, modes of motion or forces. Yet they accept and teach them. If we find, even in the natural world with which we are acquainted, matter affording a partial analogy to the difficult conception of such invisible worlds, there seems little difficulty in recognizing the possibility of such a presence. The tail of a comet, which, though attracting our attention by virtue of its luminosity, yet does not disturb or impede our vision of objects which we perceive through and beyond it, affords the first stepping stone toward a proof of the same. The tail of a comet passes rapidly across our horizon, and we should neither feel it nor be cognizant of its passage, but for the brilliant coruscation, often perceived only by a few interested in the phenomenon, while everyone else remains ignorant of its presence and of its passage through, or across, a portion of our globe. This tail may, or may not, be an integral portion of the being of the comet, but its tenuity subserves our purpose as an illustration. Indeed, it is no question of superstition, but simply a result of transcendental science, and of logic still more, to admit the existence of worlds formed of even far more attenuated matter than the tail of a comet. By denying such a possibility, science has for the last century played into the hands of neither philosophy nor true religion, but simply into those of theology. To be able to dispute the better the plurality of even material worlds, a belief thought by many churchmen incompatible with the teachings and doctrines of the Bible, Maxwell had to calumniate the memory of Newton, and to try and convince his public that the principles contained in the Newtonian philosophy are those which lie at the foundation of all atheistical systems. Dr. Whewell disputed the plurality of worlds by appeal to scientific evidence, writes Professor Winchell. And if even the habitability of physical worlds, of planets, and distant stars which shine in myriads over our heads is so disputed, how little chance is there for the acceptance of invisible worlds within the apparently transparent space of our own? But, if we can conceive of a world composed of matter still more attenuated to our senses than the tail of a comet, hence of inhabitants in it who are as ethereal, in proportion to their globe, as we are in comparison with our rocky, hard-crusted earth, no wonder if we do not perceive them, nor sense their presence or even existence. Only, In what is the idea contrary to science? Cannot men and animals, plants and rocks, be supposed to be endowed with quite a different set of senses from those we possess? Cannot their organisms be born, develop, and exist under other laws of being than those that rule our little world? Is it absolutely necessary that every corporeal being should be clothed in coats of skin like those that Adam and Eve were provided with in the legend of Genesis? Corporeality, we are told, however, by more than one man of science, may exist under very divergent conditions. Professor A. Winchell, arguing upon the plurality of worlds, makes the following remarks. It is not at all improbable that substances of a refractory nature might be so mixed with other substances, known or unknown to us, as to be capable of enduring vastly greater vicissitudes of heat and cold than is possible with terrestrial organisms. The tissues of terrestrial animals are simply suited to terrestrial conditions. Yet even here we find different types and species of animals, adapted to the trials of extremely dissimilar situations. That an animal should be a quadruped or a biped is something not depending on the necessities of organization, or instinct, or intelligence. That an animal should possess just 5 senses is not a necessity of percipient existence. There may be animals on the earth with neither smell nor taste. There may be beings on other worlds, and even on this, who possess more numerous senses than we. The possibility of this is apparent when we consider the high probability that other properties and other modes of existence lie among the resources of the cosmos, and even of terrestrial matter. There are animals which subsist where rational man would perish in the soil, in the river, and the sea, and why not human beings of different organizations, in such case? Nor is incorporated rational existence conditioned on warm blood, nor on any temperature which does not change the forms of matter of which the organism may be composed. There may be intelligences corporealized after some concept not involving the processes of injection, assimilation, and reproduction. Such bodies would not require daily food and warmth. They might be lost in the abysses of the ocean, or laid up on a stormy cliff through the tempests of an Arctic winter, or plunged in a volcano for 100 years, and yet retain consciousness and thought. It is conceivable. Why might not psychic natures be enshrined in indestructible flint and platinum? These substances are no further from the nature of intelligence than carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and lime. But, not to carry the thought to such an extreme, might not high intelligence be embodied in frames as indifferent to external conditions as the sage of the western plains, or the lichens of Labrador, the rotifers which remain dried for years, or the bacteria which pass living through boiling water? These suggestions are made simply to remind the reader how little can be argued respecting the necessary conditions of intelligent organized existence from the standard of corporeal existence found upon the earth. Intelligence is, from its nature, as universal and as uniform as the laws of the universe. Bodies are merely the local fitting of intelligence to particular modifications of universal matter or force. Do not we know through the discoveries of that same all-denying science that we are surrounded by myriads of invisible lives? If these microbes, bacteria, and the tutti quanti of the infinitesimally small are invisible to us by virtue of their minuteness, cannot there be, at the other pole, beings as invisible owing to the quality of their texture or matter to its tenuity, in fact? Conversely, as to the effects of cometary matter. Have we not another example of a half-visible form of life and matter? The ray of sunlight entering our apartment reveals in its passage myriads of tiny beings living their little life and ceasing to be, independent and heedless of whether they are or are not perceived by our grosser materiality. And so again, of the microbes and bacteria and such like unseen beings in other elements. We passed them by, during those long centuries of dreary ignorance, after the lamp of knowledge in the heathen and highly philosophical systems had ceased to throw its bright light on the ages of intolerance and bigotry of early Christianity, and we would fain pass them by again now. And yet these lives surrounded us then as they do now. They have worked on, obedient to their own laws, and it is only as they have been gradually revealed by science that we have begun to take cognizance of them and of the effects produced by them. How long has it taken the world to become what it now is? If it can be said that even up to the present day cosmic dust, which has never belonged to the earth before, reaches our globe, how much more logical is it to believe, as the occultists do, that, through the countless millions of years that have rolled away, since that dust aggregated and formed the globe we live in round its nucleus of intelligent primeval substance, many humanities differing from our present mankind as greatly as the humanity which will evolve millions of years hence will differ from our races appeared, but to disappear from the face of the earth, as will our own. These primitive and far distant humanities are denied because, as geologists think, they have left no tangible relics of themselves. All trace of them is swept away, and therefore they have never existed. Yet their relics, though very few of them, truly are to be found, and they must be discovered by geological research. But, even if they were never to be met with, there would be no reason to say that no men could have ever lived in the geological periods to which their presence on Earth is assigned. For their organisms needed no warm blood, no atmosphere, no feeding. The author of world life is right, and there is no extravagance in believing as we do, that as, on scientific hypotheses, there may be to this day psychic natures enshrined in indestructible flint and platinum, so there were psychic natures enshrined in forms of equally indestructible primeval matter, the real forefathers of our fifth race. When, therefore, as in Volume 2, we speak of men who inhabited this globe 18 million years ago, we have in mind neither the men of our present races, nor the present atmospheric laws, thermal conditions, etc. The earth and mankind, like the sun, moon, and planets, all have their growth, changes, development, and gradual evolution in their life periods. They are born, become infants, then children, adolescent, grown up, they grow old, and finally die. Why should not mankind be also under this universal law? Says Uriel to Enoch. Behold, I have showed thee all things, O Enoch. Thou seest the sun, the moon, and those which conduct the stars of heaven, which cause all their operations, seasons, and arrivals to return. In the days of sinners the years shall be shortened, everything done on earth shall be subverted, the moon shall change its laws. The days of sinners meant the days when matter would be in its full sway on earth, and man would have reached the apex of physical development in stature and animality. That came to pass during the period of the Atlanteans, about the middle point of their race, the fourth, which was drowned, as prophesied by Uriel. Since then man has been decreasing in physical stature, strength, and years, as will be shown in Volume 2. But as we are at the midpoint of our sub-race of the fifth root race, the acme of materiality in each the animal propensities, though more refined, are nonetheless developed, and this is most marked in civilized countries. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.